Hello, and thank you for joining us for part 4 of our 7-part series on Medicare Part B, Drugs and Biologicals. In this session, the focus is going to be on billing of clinical trials. Also, I wanted to point out before we get started that within the summary of this video, we have provided related resources for the material in which we'll be covering during this session. As we all know, the Medicare program is constantly changing. Here, we're just advising we've taken every reasonable effort to be sure that everything in today's presentation is up to date and accurate at the time of publication. But also keep in mind that it is the responsibility of the provider to stay abreast with any Medicare changes and/or requirements. Current Medicare regulations can be found on the CMS website. Let's go ahead and begin with what is a clinical trial. A clinical trial is an interventional study where treatment is evaluated by qualified researchers who have developed an approved protocol that assesses treatments or diagnostics. These interventional studies include the diagnostic end of the treatment and the therapeutic services that go along with the treatment. Next, let's discuss clinical trial coverage. Medicare coverage in these trials is guided by strict CMS rules and is limited to FDA-approved trials or those automatically qualifying under CMS guidelines. Medicare Part B coverage for clinical trials include routine services such as doctor visits, lab tests, surgeries, and treatments that are usually covered by Medicare when provided outside of a trial. It also covers FDA-approved IDE studies for Category B devices, which include services needed to provide or administer the investigational item, as well as patient monitoring and those lab tests. Let's discuss in more detail the routine costs and the requirements. Routine costs of a clinical trial include all items and services that are otherwise generally available to Medicare beneficiaries that are provided in either the experimental or the control arms of a clinical trial, except the investigational item itself, items and services provided solely to satisfy data collection and analysis needs and that are not used in the direct clinical management of the patient, and items and services customarily provided by the research sponsors free of charge for any enrollee in the trial. Now let's review the requirements for Medicare coverage of routine costs. Any clinical trial receiving Medicare coverage of a routine cost must meet the following 3 requirements. The subject or purpose of the trial must be the evaluation of an item or service that falls within a Medicare benefit category and is not statutorily excluded from coverage. The trial must not be designed exclusively to test toxicity or disease pathophysiology and must have therapeutic intent. Trials of therapeutic intentions or interventions must enroll patients with diagnosed disease rather than healthy volunteers, although trials of diagnostic interventions may enroll healthy patients to have a proper control group. You will want to note that these 3 requirements are insufficient by themselves to qualify as a clinical trial for Medicare coverage of routine cost. Clinical trials also should have specific desirable characteristics. However, some trials are presumed to meet these characteristics and are automatically qualified to receive Medicare coverage. Now, for a full listing of these qualifications and characteristics, they can be located in the related resources that we have provided in the summary section of this video. Now moving on to non-covered services. And some of this may be repetitive, but for non-covered services or items, including items and services for which Medicare payment is statutorily prohibited, Medicare only covers the treatment of complications arising from the delivery of the non-covered item or service in unrelated, reasonable, and necessary care. Medicare Part B does not cover experimental drugs, items, or devices unless they are typically covered by Medicare. It also excludes coverage for data collection and analysis done solely for study purposes. Additionally, no payment is made for items and services provided free of charge to beneficiaries in a clinical trial. However, if the item or service is not covered by virtue of national non-coverage policy in the Coverage Issues Manual and is the focus of a qualifying clinical trial, the routine costs of the clinical trial will be covered by Medicare, but the non-covered item or service itself will not. Next, we'll discuss Medicare Part B claim submissions for clinical trials. Medicare enrolled providers submit claims for routine services provided under an approved clinical trial and/or IDE study to their Part B MAC, including claims for Medicare beneficiaries who have enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan. The Part B deductible for professional and outpatient services is waived, but the beneficiaries do still bear the financial responsibility of the Part B coinsurance when applicable. All right, next let's discuss the use of the Q0 and Q1 modifiers. It is important to distinguish the difference between these modifiers when billing clinical trials. The Q0 is used for investigational items or services in a clinical research study. It should be appended to the Category B IDE codes in conjunction with the IDE number on the claim. Modifier Q1 applies to routine clinical service performed within a clinical trial context. It indicates services performed as part of a clinical management related to the study and requires the trial name, sponsor, and sponsor-assigned protocol number on the beneficiary's medical record. You'll want to note for claims with the Q1 appended to the CPT or HCPCS code, ICD-10 code Z00.6 must be present, and if routine services involve a Category A or B IDE device, that IDE number must also be on the claim. Next, let's move on and discuss the placement of the required clinical trial information on the CMS 1500 claim form or the 837P electronic crosswalk. Here we have referenced the proper submission and/or placement of clinical trial information, noting the crosswalk from the CMS 1500 paper form and the 837P electronic version. There are two specific items that I want to point out that are required on the claim submission. First, you want to note that it is required to report, as I mentioned, the clinical trial and/or IDE numbers on the claim submission, as missing this information is actually a common denial that we see at NGS. As shown on the chart, the clinical trial number is required on line 19 or the electronic equivalent, while the IDE number should be referenced in line 23 or the electronic equivalent. The next item that you want to note the placement of is the Q0 and the Q1 modifiers that we just reviewed. These modifiers are required on line 24D of the CMS 1500 form or the electronic equivalent, and you will want to append the Q0 to the drug code and the Q1 to the administration code. Now, claims lacking in these identifiers will be rejected, requiring resubmission with the necessary information, which of course turns into a delay in payment for the claim. That wraps up our information on clinical trials. For more drug and biological guidance, please consider viewing the rest of our series, which offers information on coverage and reimbursement, vaccination and administration, NOC and compound drugs, self-administered and free of charge drugs, modifiers JW and JZ for drug waste, and also general billing guidelines for drugs and biologicals. Thank you for taking the time to view our educational material. We hope this information was helpful for you.